Welcome to Torah Tuesday. We have three short stories today. Starting at the end of chapter 15, we have three short stories about water and food. Both of these things are precious resources for people in a desert wilderness, and all of these stories share a theme about testing. It's either about God testing Israel or about Israel testing God. So let's just have a look at each of the stories individually, and then we'll talk about God's testing at the end. First story comes at the end of chapter 15, and we hear that Israel have left the Red Sea and they've walked for 3 days through the wilderness without water. And then when they find water, it's bitter, it's undrinkable. And so as a result, the people grumble to Aaron and Moses. Now, we've seen them grumble a few times already, but in these three stories we're about to see today, we start to see a pattern emerging, a pattern of behavior. Chapter 15, verse 24, the people grumbled against Moses, "What are we to drink?" So Moses, he takes this complaint to God, and God provides a solution. He says, take this branch, this tree, and put this in the water, and the water will no longer be bitter. It'll be drinkable. And then we're introduced to this idea of God's testing in verse 25. There, the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. So what is the test? Well, God is interested to see if these people will be obedient to him. So he has them face trying situations like this one to test their trust in him. So this is the first story. We have to skate over these things. There's so much more to be said, but let's move on. Second story. It's the whole of chapter 16, this one. It's much longer. It's probably much more famous. So the people have moved on from Elam, and they are in the wilderness again, and they grumble again, this time because it's a lack of food. They're upset because when they were in Egypt, they had pots of meat and they ate all that they wanted. But Moses has brought them out to this wilderness to starve the entire assembly to death. And so God tests them again. This time, he will provide bread and quail from heaven. But the bread will be a test of their trust. There's two aspects of this test. Firstly, the people are to go out each day and gather enough just for that day, not more. And the second aspect is that on the sixth day, they are to gather enough for 2 days and not go out on the seventh day. That's the test, and Israel fails on both fronts. Verse 20 says, however, some of them paid no attention to Moses' instructions, and they kept part of it until the morning, meaning they kept it for longer than a day, and it was full of maggots and began to smell. And then verse 27 says, nevertheless, some of the people did go out on the seventh day to gather. So they failed the test. And yet, despite their failure, God is not hesitant to be generous to them. God continues to show them grace. He is the God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. That's what his name is. That's who he is. And so the final story of the set of three, it's the one about striking the rock to produce water. No, this is not the one where Moses does the wrong thing. That's going to come later. But yeah, these stories are all so important in the history of Israel. So here's how the story goes. They made camp at a place called Rephidim, and there's no water to drink, just like there was no water to drink for them back in Marah. And so they quarrel with Moses, and Moses replies, why are you quarreling with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? And so in the last two stories, God has tested them, and now it says that Israel is putting Yahweh to the test. And so Moses goes to God, and God instructs Moses of what to do. And so Moses calls this place, he instructs Moses about what to do, to strike the rock and water will come from it. And so Moses, he calls this place Massah and Meribah. And both of those names are going to be really important in the history of Israel because they become associated with Israel's tendency to disobey God and to not trust him. So it becomes emblematic of that tendency towards not trusting God. And we'll hear more about it as we read through the Torah. And if you go and read the Psalms as well, this place is mentioned quite often. And then at the end of chapter 17, you have the fight with the Amalekites. But we're going to talk about that next week. So let's just leave that for now. Just to wrap up this one, what are we to make of God testing his people? Now, it's important to notice that this isn't the first time that testing has come up in the story so far. Remember all the way back to Abraham and his son Isaac. Just before Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain to sacrifice him, the story begins by saying, sometime later, God tested Abraham. But that's not the first test either. If you go all the way back to the first pages, the Edom story is an episode of testing as well, isn't it? God puts one tree in the middle of the garden, says, do not eat from it. That's a test. It's actually very similar to the stories we read today. It's food being used as a test. See, God isn't trying to set his people up for failure with these tests. What he's actually doing is he's giving them an opportunity to prove that they trust him. So this don't see it as a kind of a vindictive test. See it as God providing an opportunity. But in all of the stories that we've read today and in Eden, they failed the test. Now, remember that Jesus was also presented with a lack of food and water in the wilderness. Do you remember this? 40 days, just like the 40 years of the wandering of Israel in the wilderness. But the thing about Jesus is that he didn't grumble, he didn't quarrel, he didn't take Satan's temptation. Jesus passes the test. And that is good for us, that Jesus passed the test. So Jesus is the one who passed the test when we are not able to. But the truth is that God will still give his people tests like this. But again, they shouldn't be seen as cruel tests, but they should be seen as opportunities. Opportunities to exercise faith in God, to develop and mature our trust in him as believers. That's what we are. We're believers. We're meant to be growing in our belief. And remember James's advice in his letter. He says, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials is one translation, but tests is an equally valid translation. And then in verse 3 it says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And then it says, let endurance have its perfect result so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So we will face tests as well. And it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate our trust in God through those tests, to follow the way of Jesus rather than the way of Israel. Have a good day.